Stefanski didn't want him to play. It seems as if he didn't care for him. Go through so many circumstances just to get on the
Super quick follow-up on that. Why wouldn't you, just to see if it does anything to the offense, give him an opportunity to go in there and play?
Yeah, obviously my focus is where we are right now, Mary Kay. That's not my focus.
TJ Houshmandzade just said something on live television that has the entire NFL media world spinning right now. The former Browns wide receiver, current analyst, didn't hold back when discussing Kevin Stefanski and Shedeur Sanders. And what he revealed, it's the kind of statement that makes you sit back and ask yourself, hold up, was this really what was happening in Cleveland this whole time? Because listen, we've all been watching this situation unfold. We've seen Shedeur Sanders come into the league with expectations, pressure, and a spotlight that follows him everywhere. We've seen the Browns struggling at quarterback for what feels like forever. And we've watched Kevin Stefanski make decision after decision that left fans, analysts, and apparently even former players scratching their heads. But TJ didn't just scratch his head. He went on record and said what a lot of people have been thinking but wouldn't say out loud. According to TJ Houshmandzade, Kevin Stefanski never wanted Shedeur Sanders to play. Not because of performance, not because of development timelines, not because of scheme fit or any of the football reasons you'd normally hear from a coaching staff. TJ made it sound personal. He made it sound like there was something deeper going on behind closed doors in that facility. And when a former player who's been in those locker rooms, who understands the dynamics, who knows how coaching staffs operate, when that guy comes out and says something like this, you have to pay attention. Now let's be clear about what we're doing here. We're not reporting breaking news. We're not claiming we have insider sources feeding us information from inside the Browns organization. We're reacting to what TJ Houshmandzade said publicly, on television, for everyone to hear. We're looking at the timeline of events that we've all witnessed. We're connecting dots based on what's played out in front of our eyes all season long. And we're asking the questions that need to be asked when something doesn't add up. So let's walk through this from the beginning because context matters. Shedeur Sanders gets drafted by the Cleveland Browns. This is a team that has been searching for quarterback stability for years. They've cycled through options, tried different veterans, drafted prospects, and nothing has stuck. The quarterback position has been a revolving door of disappointment and missed opportunities. Then they draft Shedeur Sanders, a player who comes from Colorado, who played under his father Deion Sanders, who has experience, who has arm talent, who has shown the ability to handle pressure and make plays. You would think that a team desperate for answers at the most important position in football would be eager to see what they have. You would think the coaching staff would be invested in developing this young quarterback, giving him opportunities to grow, putting him in positions to succeed. You would think that even if he's not ready to start immediately, there would be a clear development plan, a path forward, a sense that the organization believes in what they drafted. But from what we've seen, that's not what happened. From the moment Shedeur arrived in Cleveland, the vibe felt off. The media coverage around him was different. The way the coaching staff talked about the quarterback situation was different. There were reports about who was getting first-team reps in practice. There were depth chart decisions that raised eyebrows. There were games where the starting quarterback struggled, where the offense looked stagnant, where you'd expect a coaching staff to at least consider making a change or giving the young guy a shot, and it didn't happen. And TJ Houshmandzade saw all of this. He watched it unfold just like we did, but he had a different perspective. He's been in NFL locker rooms. He knows what it looks like when a coach believes in a player versus when a coach has already made up his mind. And according to TJ, Kevin Stefanski had made up his mind about Shedeur Sanders before the kid even had a real chance to prove himself. Now TJ didn't just drop this bomb and walk away. He elaborated. He talked about how unusual this situation was. He mentioned that in all his years playing professional football and all his time around the NFL, he had never seen a coach show such resistance to playing a quarterback when the team clearly didn't have a better option. That's a powerful statement, because TJ has seen a lot of football. He's played for multiple organizations. He's been around different coaching staffs with different philosophies. And for him to say that this was unlike anything he'd witnessed before, that tells you something. Let's talk about what actually happened on the field this season, because this isn't just speculation or reading tea leaves. We can look at the actual games, the actual decisions, the actual results. The Browns started the season with a veteran quarterback who was supposed to provide stability. That didn't work out. The offense struggled, turnovers piled up, games were lost, and throughout all of this, Shedeur Sanders remained on the sideline. Now you could argue that maybe the coaching staff felt he wasn't ready. Maybe they thought he needed more time to learn the system. Maybe they were concerned about throwing him into a difficult situation and damaging his confidence. Those are all legitimate coaching considerations. But here's the thing, at what point do those concerns stop being valid? At what point does a coaching staff have to admit that what they're doing isn't working and it's time to try something different? Because from what we saw, that point never came. Week after week, game after game, the Browns continued to trot out the same struggling offense with the same struggling quarterback while Shedeur Sanders sat and watched. And it wasn't just that he wasn't starting. According to reports and observations from people covering the team, he wasn't even getting significant reps in practice. He wasn't being prepared as if he might actually need to play. It was as if the coaching staff had decided from day one that Shedeur Sanders was not going to be part of their plans, regardless of how the season unfolded. Houshmandzade pointed out something else that's really important here. He talked about how quarterbacks are typically developed in the NFL. Even when a young quarterback isn't ready to start immediately, there's usually a process. They get reps with the second team. They get situational work. They might come in for specific packages or in garbage time to get live game experience. The coaching staff talks about their progress. They talk about what the young quarterback needs to work on. They create a sense that this player is part of the future plans. None of that seemed to happen with Shedeur Sanders in Cleveland. The messaging was vague, the opportunities were non-existent, and the overall sense you got from watching this unfold was that Shedeur was being kept at arm's length by the coaching staff, not because he did something wrong, not because he wasn't working hard or wasn't talented enough, but for reasons that nobody could quite explain publicly. And that's where TJ's comments become so significant, because he's essentially saying what a lot of people were thinking but couldn't prove, that this wasn't about football. This wasn't about protecting a young quarterback or following a development plan. This was something else, something more personal, something that had to do with Kevin Stefanski's feelings about Shedeur Sanders as a person, as a player, or maybe about the circumstances surrounding his arrival in Cleveland. Now let's talk about the media reaction to TJ's comments, because this thing blew up. Sports talk shows spent entire segments dissecting what he said. Analysts debated whether TJ was out of line or whether he was speaking a truth that needed to be said. Fans flooded social media with their own takes, their own observations, their own stories about what they'd noticed throughout the season. And the overwhelming sentiment, a lot of people weren't surprised. A lot of people felt like TJ was confirming what they'd suspected all along. Think about that for a second. When someone makes an explosive claim like this, you'd expect more skepticism. You'd expect people to push back and say, wait, that doesn't make sense, or you're reading too much into it. But that's not what happened. Instead, people started connecting dots. They started bringing up specific moments from press conferences where Stefanski seemed uncomfortable talking about Shedeur. They pointed to depth chart decisions that never quite made sense. They highlighted games where the offense was so bad that any reasonable coaching staff would have at least considered making a change. The more people talked about it, the more it felt like TJ. It opened a door that a lot of folks had been standing in front of, afraid to knock. Because it's one thing to criticize play calling or game management. It's another thing entirely to suggest that a head coach might have personal feelings influencing his professional decisions. That's a serious allegation. That's the kind of thing that, if true, fundamentally undermines the integrity of how an organization operates. But here's where we have to be really careful. We're not saying we know for certain what was in Kevin Stefanski's head. We're not claiming to have proof of anything beyond what TJ Houshmandzade said publicly and what we've all observed. What we're saying is that the situation raises uncomfortable questions. It creates a pattern that's hard to ignore. It makes you wonder what was really going on behind closed doors in Cleveland. Let's also talk about Shedeur Sanders himself in all of this, because he deserves credit for how he's handled an incredibly difficult situation. Imagine being a young quarterback drafted into the NFL with all the expectations that come with being Deion Sanders' son. The pressure on you is already enormous. Every move you make is scrutinized. Every throw is analyzed. Every interview is dissected for signs of attitude or entitlement, or whether you're living up to the hype. Now add to that the reality that your own coaching staff doesn't seem to want you on the field. You're working hard in practice. You're studying film. You're doing everything you're supposed to do as a professional. And yet week after week you're not getting opportunities. You're watching quarterbacks who are clearly struggling continue to play while you sit. You're hearing whispers and rumors about why you're not playing, about what the coaching staff thinks of you, about whether you have a future with the organization. That would break a lot of people. That would create resentment, frustration, bitterness. It would be easy to let that situation poison your mindset, to start pointing fingers publicly, to create drama and make it all about you. But from what we've seen, Shedeur didn't do that. He stayed professional. He kept his head down. He continued to prepare as if his number might get called even when it became increasingly clear that it wouldn't. That shows maturity. That shows mental toughness. That shows the kind of character that you want in a franchise quarterback. And it makes the whole situation even more frustrating, because here's a kid doing everything right, handling adversity with grace, and still not getting a fair shake from his coaching staff. Now, TJ Houshmandzade also touched on something else that's really important: the impact this kind of situation has on a young player's development. When you draft a quarterback, especially one with the profile and expectations of Shedeur Sanders, you're making an investment. You're betting on that player's potential. You're committing to developing him into the kind of quarterback who can lead your franchise for years to come. But development doesn't just happen automatically. It requires coaching. It requires game experience. It requires the confidence that comes from knowing your organization believes in you. When you take a young quarterback and essentially shelve him, when you don't give him reps, when you don't prepare him to play, when you don't create opportunities for him to grow, you're wasting that investment. You're potentially damaging a player's confidence and development in ways that might be hard to recover from. And that's what makes TJ's comments so damning. Because if he's right, if Kevin Stefanski really did have personal feelings that kept him from giving Shedeur Sanders a fair opportunity, then the Browns didn't just fail to develop their young quarterback. They actively hindered his growth. They put him in a position where success was nearly impossible, and that's organizational malpractice at the highest level. Let's also consider the broader context of the Cleveland Browns organization during all of this. This is a franchise that has struggled for years to find stability at quarterback. They've tried the veteran route. They've tried drafting developmental prospects. They've tried trading for established starters. Nothing has worked. The quarterback position has been a black hole of disappointment and dysfunction for this franchise. So when they finally draft Shedeur Sanders, a quarterback with legitimate talent and potential, you would think the entire organization would be aligned around making sure this investment pays off. You would think everyone from the ownership to the coaching staff to the front office would be committed to giving this young quarterback every possible chance to succeed. But based on what we've seen and what TJ Houshmandzade has said, that alignment didn't exist. And that raises questions about the structure and communication within the Browns organization. Who made the decision to draft Shedeur Sanders? Was it the front office? Was Kevin Stefanski on board with that decision? Did he have input? Did he want a different quarterback? Was Shedeur forced on him by the ownership or general manager? Because if there was a disconnect at that foundational level, if Stefanski didn't want Shedeur from the beginning, then everything that followed makes a lot more sense. That's not an excuse, by the way. A professional coach, especially a head coach in the NFL, needs to be able to work with the players his organization gives him. That's part of the job. You don't get to sabotage a player just because he wasn't your first choice. But it would help explain the dysfunction we witnessed. It would help explain why Shedeur never seemed to get a fair opportunity. TJ Houshmandzade also mentioned something about how this situation affected team dynamics. Because it's not just about Shedeur Sanders. When you have a coaching staff that appears to be biased against one player, when there's obvious favoritism or personal feelings influencing roster decisions, that creates tension in the locker room. Other players notice. They see what's happening. They form their own opinions about whether it's fair or justified. Some players might side with the coaching staff. They might think Shedeur hasn't earned his spot yet, that he needs to wait his turn, that the coaches know what they're doing. Other players might sympathize with Shedeur. They might think he's getting a raw deal, that he deserves more opportunities, that something unfair is happening. And that division, that tension, that uncertainty about whether decisions are being made for the right reasons, that undermines team unity. It creates factions. It makes it harder to win games. And maybe that's part of why the Browns struggled this season. Maybe it wasn't just about the quarterback play or the offensive line or the play calling. Maybe it was also about a fractured locker room dealing with drama and dysfunction that nobody wanted to talk about publicly, but everyone could feel. The fan reaction to all of this has been intense. Browns fans, who have suffered through decades of disappointment and false hope, desperately wanted Shedeur Sanders to be the answer. They wanted to believe that finally, after all these years, they had found their franchise quarterback. So when it became clear that he wasn't getting opportunities, when the season spiraled and Shedeur remained on the sideline, frustration boiled over. Social media was flooded with fans demanding that Shedeur play. They created hashtags, they called into sports radio shows, they showed up to games with signs. The message was clear: give the kid a chance. Let us see what we have. Stop wasting our time with quarterbacks who clearly aren't the answer. And through it all, the coaching staff remained stubborn. They stuck with their plan, or lack thereof, and ignored the growing chorus of voices demanding change. TJ Houshmandzade's comments validated those fans. They gave voice to the frustration that had been building all season. They confirmed that it wasn't just casual observers who thought something was wrong. Experienced NFL players saw it too. And that validation matters. It means the fans weren't crazy. It means their observations and instincts were correct. Something really was off about how the Browns were handling Shedeur Sanders. Now let's talk about what all of this means for Kevin Stefanski. Because TJ didn't just criticize his handling of Shedeur Sanders. He suggested that this situation played a role in Stefanski eventually losing his job. And if that's true, if the Browns organization ultimately decided that Stefanski's personal feelings and bias were undermining the team's success, then this is a massive story about accountability and organizational dysfunction. Head coaches in the NFL have enormous power. They control the roster. They make personnel decisions. They determine who plays and who sits. They shape the culture and direction of the entire franchise. And with that power comes responsibility. Coaches are supposed to make decisions based on what's best for the team, not on personal preferences or feelings. They're supposed to give every player a fair chance to prove themselves. They're supposed to be objective evaluators of talent who put the team's success above everything else. If Kevin Stefanski failed to do that with Shedeur Sanders, if he let personal bias influence his professional decisions, then he failed in one of the fundamental responsibilities of his position. And the Browns organization, if they recognized that and made a change, would be doing what any serious franchise should do when a coach loses sight of what's important. But here's the uncomfortable reality. We may never know for sure what really happened. Kevin Stefanski isn't going to come out and admit that he had personal feelings against Shedeur Sanders. The Browns organization isn't going to release a statement saying their head coach was biased. These things don't get acknowledged publicly in the NFL. They get handled behind closed doors, in meetings and conversations that we'll never hear about. So we're left with what we can observe. We're left with TJ Houshmandzade's comments. We're left with the timeline of events that unfolded throughout the season. We're left with the questions that don't have satisfying answers. And we're left wondering what could have been if Shedeur Sanders had been given a fair opportunity to show what he could do. Let's also consider what this means for Shedeur's future. Because regardless of what happened with Kevin Stefanski, Shedeur Sanders is still a young quarterback with his whole career ahead of him. The question now is whether the damage done during his time with the Browns can be repaired. Can he recover from a rookie season where he barely played? Can he rebuild confidence that may have been shaken by feeling unwanted and unsupported? Can he trust the next coaching staff he works with, knowing what happened with the last one? These are real psychological and developmental challenges. It's not easy to come back from a situation like this, but Shedeur has shown resilience. He's shown mental toughness. He's shown the ability to handle adversity without letting it destroy him. So maybe with the right coaching staff, with the right support system, with an organization that actually believes in him and wants him to succeed, he can overcome this setback and become the quarterback everyone thought he could be. The Browns organization now has decisions to make. They need a new head coach. They need to figure out their quarterback situation. They need to decide whether they're committed to Shedeur Sanders or whether they're going to start over again with someone else. And whatever they decide, they need to make sure they've learned from what happened with Kevin Stefanski. They need to make sure their next coach is someone who will give every player a fair opportunity, who will make decisions based on merit and what's best for the team, not on personal feelings or bias. TJ Houshmandzade's comments have also sparked a broader conversation about player treatment in the NFL. How often does this kind of thing happen? How many young players have had their careers derailed or stunted because a coach didn't like them for reasons that had nothing to do with football? How many organizations have dysfunction and bias in their coaching staffs that never gets exposed publicly? These are uncomfortable questions that the league probably doesn't want to address, but they're questions worth asking. Because the NFL is a business, but it's also a league of human beings. Players are people with dreams and aspirations and careers that can be made or broken by the decisions of their coaches. When those decisions are being made for the wrong reasons, when personal feelings trump professional evaluation, that's a problem. That's something that should concern everyone who cares about the integrity of the sport. The media coverage of this story has been fascinating to watch. Some analysts have defended Kevin Stefanski, arguing that we don't know all the facts, that maybe there were legitimate football reasons for his decisions that we're not privy to. Others have sided with TJ Houshmandzade, pointing to the pattern of behavior and the mounting evidence that something wasn't right. The debate has created compelling television and passionate arguments on both sides. But what's interesting is that even the people defending Stefanski struggle to explain away all the questions. Why didn't Shedeur get more practice reps? Why wasn't he prepared as a legitimate backup option? Why did the coaching staff seem so resistant to even discussing him as a possibility when the starting quarterback was clearly struggling? The answers to these questions, even from Stefanski's defenders, often boil down to trust the coach, or they know more than we do. And that's not really an answer. That's asking for blind faith in a system that, based on results, clearly wasn't working. One thing that's been lost in all of this drama is the actual football evaluation of Shedeur Sanders as a player. Because whether Kevin Stefanski was biased against him or not, Shedeur is still a young quarterback with strengths and weaknesses that need to be honestly assessed. He has arm talent, he has experience, he has mental toughness, but like any young quarterback, he also has areas where he needs to improve. His footwork needs refinement. His decision-making under pressure needs development. His ability to read complex NFL defenses needs more seasoning. The point is, there are legitimate football conversations to be had about Shedeur Sanders, but those conversations got overshadowed by all the drama and dysfunction surrounding his rookie season. Instead of talking about his development as a player, we're talking about whether his coach gave him a fair chance. Instead of analyzing his throws and decision-making, we're analyzing the bizarre circumstances that kept him off the field. And that's a tragedy because Shedeur deserves to be evaluated on his merits as a football player, not on the dysfunction of the organization that drafted him. Houshmandzade's decision to speak out about this publicly was brave. Because let's be real, former players don't usually call out coaches by name like this. There's an unwritten code in the NFL, a sense that you don't air dirty laundry publicly, that you keep internal issues internal. By breaking that code, TJ opened himself up to criticism. Some people accused him of stirring up drama or trying to stay relevant by making controversial statements. But TJ clearly felt that what he witnessed was serious enough that it needed to be said. Maybe that's what this moment really is. A former player who saw something wrong, who watched a young quarterback get treated unfairly, and who decided that staying silent wasn't an option anymore. Maybe TJ looked at Shedeur Sanders and saw a talented kid being sabotaged by coach's personal feelings, and he couldn't just let that slide. Maybe he felt a responsibility to speak up, to validate what everyone was seeing, to force the conversation that needed to happen. The timing of TJ's comments is also significant. This didn't happen during the season when Kevin Stefanski still had his job and could potentially retaliate. This happened after Stefanski was fired, after the decision had already been made, after the Browns were moving in a different direction. Some might argue that makes TJ's comments less brave, that it's easy to pile on after someone's already been fired. But think about it differently. Maybe TJ waited until now precisely because he wanted to explain to fans what they had been watching all season. Maybe he wanted to give context to why Stefanski was fired. Maybe he wanted people to understand that this wasn't just about wins and losses. It was about how a coach treated his players. The Cleveland Browns have been one of the most dysfunctional franchises in professional sports for decades. They've gone through coach after coach, quarterback after quarterback, regime after regime, and nothing has worked. The dysfunction is so deep, so ingrained, that it's become part of the franchise's identity. And what Houshmandzade exposed is just another chapter in that long, sad story of organizational failure. But maybe, just maybe, this is also an opportunity. Maybe exposing what happened with Kevin Stefanski and Shedeur Sanders forces the Browns to take a hard look at how they operate. Maybe it makes them more careful about who they hire as their next head coach. Maybe it makes them more committed to creating a culture where every player gets a fair opportunity. Maybe it forces accountability at a level this franchise hasn't seen in years. Or maybe nothing changes. Maybe the Browns hire another coach who brings his own biases and blind spots. Maybe they give up on Shedeur Sanders and draft another quarterback who goes through the same cycle of hype and disappointment. Maybe the dysfunction continues because it's so deeply embedded in the organization's DNA that no amount of exposure or public scrutiny can fix it. That's the uncomfortable reality for Browns fans. They've seen this movie before. They've watched their team make the same mistakes over and over again with different people. They've had their hopes raised only to see them crushed by organizational incompetence and dysfunction. So even now, with Houshmandzade's comments confirming what they suspected, with Kevin Stefanski gone and a new era supposedly beginning, there's skepticism, there's doubt. There's a sense that until the Browns actually prove they can do things differently, nothing will really change. Shedeur Sanders represents something important to this franchise and its fans, though. He represents hope. He represents the possibility that maybe finally, after all these years, the Browns have found their franchise quarterback. But that hope has been tainted by the dysfunction of his rookie season. It's been complicated by questions about whether he was given a fair chance, whether he was developed properly, whether his confidence was damaged by how he was treated. And now the Browns have to figure out how to salvage this situation. They have to figure out how to restore Shedeur's confidence, how to create an environment where he can develop and succeed, how to convince him that this organization believes in him even though the previous coaching staff clearly didn't. That's a tall order for any franchise, but especially for one with the Browns' track record of dysfunction. The question that keeps coming up in all of this is simple but profound. What if Kevin Stefanski had given Shedeur Sanders a real chance? What if he had approached the situation without bias, without personal feelings, with a genuine commitment to developing the young quarterback? What if Shedeur had gotten first-team reps in practice, had been prepared as a legitimate option, had actually played in games when the starting quarterback was struggling? We'll never know the answer to that question. We'll never know if Shedeur would have seized the opportunity and shown he's ready to be a starting quarterback in the NFL. We'll never know if he would have struggled initially but shown enough promise to justify continued development. We'll never know because the opportunity was never really given. And that's the tragedy at the heart of this entire story. Houshmandzade's comments have ensured that this story won't just fade away. It's going to be part of the narrative surrounding the Cleveland Browns moving forward. Every decision they make about Shedeur Sanders, every coaching hire, every roster move, it's all going to be viewed through the lens of what happened with Kevin Stefanski. The organization is going to have to prove that they've learned from this disaster, that they're committed to doing things differently, that they won't let personal bias and dysfunction derail another young quarterback's development. But here's what makes this whole situation so unsettling. We're talking about grown men, professionals at the highest level of their sport, and there's evidence suggesting that personal feelings may have trumped professional responsibility. That's not just a football problem, that's a human problem. It's a reminder that even in the NFL, even with millions of dollars on the line, even with careers and livelihoods at stake, people still make decisions based on emotions and bias rather than logic and merit. And if that happened with Shedeur Sanders and Kevin Stefanski, how often does it happen elsewhere in the league? How many other young players are being held back by coaches who don't like them for reasons that have nothing to do with football? How many organizations have similar dysfunction that just hasn't been exposed yet? These are uncomfortable questions that go beyond the Browns, beyond this specific situation, to the heart of how the NFL operates. The reality is, we're probably never going to get all the answers. Kevin Stefanski isn't going to sit down for an interview where he admits he was biased against Shedeur Sanders. The Browns aren't going to release internal documents detailing the dysfunction of their coaching staff. The NFL isn't going to conduct an investigation into how young quarterbacks are treated by their coaches. This story is going to remain in that frustrating gray area where we know something wasn't right, where we have testimony from someone who was there, where the pattern of behavior is damning, but where we can't prove anything definitively. Maybe that's the most maddening part of all of this, because Shedeur Sanders' rookie season, what should have been the beginning of his NFL journey, is now forever tainted by questions and controversy. Even if he goes on to have a great career, people will always wonder what might have been different if he had been given a fair opportunity from the start. Even if he struggles, people will debate whether he's truly not good enough or whether his development was sabotaged before it ever really began. Houshmandzade made sure that we're having these conversations. He made sure that what he saw and experienced in Cleveland didn't just get swept under the rug. He made sure that Shedeur Sanders' side of the story, the reality of what this young quarterback went through, became part of the public record. And regardless of what happens next, that matters. Because in the end, this isn't just about football, it's about fairness. It's about young players being given legitimate opportunities to prove themselves. It's about coaches being held accountable when they let personal feelings influence professional decisions. It's about organizations having the courage to address dysfunction even when it's uncomfortable. And it's about speaking truth even when there's pressure to stay silent. The Cleveland Browns are at a crossroads. Shedeur Sanders is at a crossroads. And the NFL, whether it wants to admit it or not, is facing questions about how players are treated, how coaches are held accountable, and what happens when personal bias infects professional decisions. Houshmandzade started a conversation that needed to happen. Where it goes from here, how the Browns respond, whether anything actually changes, those are all questions that remain unanswered. What we know for certain is this: something wasn't right in Cleveland. A young quarterback wasn't given a fair opportunity. A former player who witnessed it firsthand felt compelled to speak out. And now everyone is watching to see what the Browns do next. Will they learn from this disaster? Will they create an environment where Shedeur Sanders can actually develop and succeed? Will they hire a coach who evaluates players on merit rather than personal feelings? Or will this just be another chapter in the long, depressing history of Cleveland Browns dysfunction? Another promising young player whose career gets derailed by organizational failure. Another situation where fans are left wondering what might have been if things had been handled differently. Those questions don't have answers yet, and maybe that's the point. Maybe we're not supposed to have closure. Maybe we're supposed to sit with the discomfort of not knowing, of watching a situation unfold that doesn't make sense, of seeing a young player get treated in a way that raises more questions than it answers. Maybe that discomfort is what forces change, what makes organizations think twice, what ensures that the next young quarterback doesn't go through what Shedeur Sanders went through. Houshmandzade made sure we're all uncomfortable. He made sure we're all asking questions. He made sure that what happened in Cleveland can't just be ignored or explained away with coach speak and corporate public relations statements. And now we wait to see what comes next, knowing that whatever happens, the story of Shedeur Sanders' rookie season will always be complicated by what we learned from TJ's revelation.